All right. Good evening. I'd like to call to order our meeting today for the Policy Committee. It is Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. It is 6:03 p.m. My name is Roberto Rodriguez. I am the chair of the committee. Before I get started, if we can do, I'm trying to get in the habit of doing this for all of our meetings. If we can do just a really quick round of introductions of who is here. Just give us your name and whatever title you have that corresponds to you being on a panelist for tonight. So I'll start off, Mr. Irish, if you can start off, please, and then just hand it off to someone else, please.
Certainly. Thank you. Jeff Irish, represent 5th District. I'll pass it off to Aura.
Hi, I'm Aura Russell-Better, and I'm the District 4 school board member. How about Emily?
Hi, my name is Emily Chung. I'm the student board representative for Deering High School, and I'll pass it to Mr. Botana.
I'm Javier Botana, superintendent, and I will pass it to Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne Rothaker. I'm the district office manager and executive assistant to the superintendent, and I'll pass it off to Mr. Townsend.
Good evening, Aaron Townsend, Assistant Superintendent for School Management and staff for the Policy Committee, and I'm glad to have Mr. Jake Giesman with us tonight. So Jake.
Hi, Jake Giesman, Assistant Principal, Lyman Moore Middle School, and currently Interim Principal of Portland's Remote Academy.
Great, that's everyone here today. So I'll real quick, I just want to go through the agenda and then go get into it right away. So first thing we're going to do is approve the minutes for our last meeting. Then we'll pick up on the discipline policy review. And we had some changes on a policy that we're going to postpone, so we'll get into that. And then we'll continue our debriefing of the community conversation for the law enforcement policies. So having said that, first thing on the agenda is approval of our minutes for the March 3rd, 2021 minutes. Do we have a motion? All right, Mr. Irish. Second, Ms. Russell-Better. Do we have any questions on the minutes? Okay, I don't see any. Is there any public comments on the minutes for the March 3rd meeting? And just as a heads up, because we do have a couple of attendees, if we have any questions or any public comments, like I'm asking for right now, any opportunity for public comment, we'll use the Zoom raise your hand feature, which can be found under the participants panelist, or if you hover over your name, it should give you the option to raise your hand. And then I will call on your name, and then I'll go through the public comment rules. So if there's no, if there isn't any public comment for the minutes for March 3rd, and I don't see any hands raised, I'll bring it back for the board, to the committee for any other discussion on the minutes. Seeing none. So all those in favor of approving the minutes, please indicate, and we can just raise our hands. And that's unanimous with everyone in favor. Okay, and then next on the agenda, we're going to do we're going to get into the discipline policy review. Aaron, do you want to take over and get us started? All right, perfect. So I'll hand it off to Aaron Townsend. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. So excited to continue our work with these discipline policies tonight. In just a moment, I'll ask Jake to help us kind of step through some of our last policies. If you'll remember a couple of things before we get into it tonight. One, we had spent time on the suspension policy last time, and there was a question about elementary, the use of elementary or suspensions at the elementary grade span. And, one of the next steps was engaging elementary school leaders in that notion. And so I had kind of advised, Mr. Rodriguez before, that given, it's a little bit of a shorter turnaround, but most significantly, the focus with our elementary leaders has been squarely on returning to in-person instruction and the various strategies around that. So we have not had space to have a substantive dialogue about that issue yet. So I think we'll need to talk as a group about where that leaves us with what we want to do with that policy specifically, but then also the broader set. Where we were today is the aim had been to kind of finalize this second review, and at this point to be kind of taking, to potentially take action as a group and, as the policy committee in terms of referring these then to the full board. So that's the timeline we've been working towards. So what I would propose is that we still have a few policies that we haven't gotten to for a kind of a second final read from this group based on other feedback. So I would propose we address those. Those include the one we didn't get to last time, weapons, violence, and school safety, policy JICIA, the bullying and cyberbullying policy, and the expulsion policy. I would propose we work through those, right, and discuss the proposed revisions and land on that. Jake has brought back, we had we shared these policies with the Portland Education Association, which I think I mentioned in our last meeting. And so there are a few minor changes to a couple of the policies we looked at previously, JIC, the Student Code of Conduct, and JK, Student Discipline. So we have these back in here just to briefly name kind of what some of those, I think generally non-substantive additions were, but just for visibility for everybody. So ideally we can work through those and then decide where we're at, right? And kind of what our next steps would be, with this set of policies and, consideration of what we do with the suspension policy within that. Are there any questions about any of that first or anything?
So big takeaways is that we're going to postpone the conversation about the elementary school suspensions until we get an opportunity to hear from the school leaderships, and then right now, I guess picking up on the on the rest of the policies discussion. So if we're good with that. I'm perfectly fine with that. I think that that's appropriate, and I think that getting the input from the teachers was key to to the conversation, and that was kind of like literally was the starting point. So making time for that to happen, it seems not just appropriate but critical. So if anyone else has any questions or any other, I'm sorry, Aura, I see your hand raised. I should probably open my participants window. Go ahead.
Thank you. So Aaron, just as far as time frame, would you hope then for our next meeting, like in a month, that we would be coming back to the discipline, or just not sure depending on, I hear what you're saying about the focus on increasing in person. It must be hard to ask for a different focus right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is one of a few things that we're trying to move. I mean, it's important. I feel like, I don't want to just drop it. I think, the tension I've been kind of managed is just kind of dropping it there without, kind of having some space to tee it up and have consideration given the other things so that it gets kind of meaningful consideration from folks. I think our next meeting is follows after April break. So we will be going through the ramp up and, ideally launch of the increase of in-person instruction. So this next month is pretty rugged to just work through all those kind of plans and what that looks like. So I'm a little, I think, I feel like we will encounter some of the same challenges over the next month, but I think, I'm curious or, interested in the discussion of like, hey, can we get through all the rest of these anyway tonight? I feel optimistic somewhat about that, but and then where does that leave us in terms of how much would that delay the overall action we want to take with this set of policies? What we have talked about, though, doesn't have to be our process. Was bringing all of these together as one batch of policies to have as a first read, workshop, and then second read in terms of full board action. So I'm mindful of kind of our goals and timelines associated with that, and still committed to like having all this in place, right? We have that, and then the law enforcement work that our goal as a committee is to have those board approved by, the end of this academic year so that they're in place for the launch of the next academic year. So that's by the end of June. That's, of course, is a self-imposed deadline, but I think it makes sense for lots of reasons in terms of the work we're moving forward to be prepared for next school year and a return to in-person learning and some of the priorities we want to establish. So I think it'd be worth it for us to get through these and then kind of have a discussion about what are our next steps and the timeline associated with that.
Okay, thank you. I would be comfortable as you shared that. I didn't even think about the ramping up and then break and then the intensity stuff is under with that. So I just would share, I'd feel comfortable putting it off further than that. I think I was thinking about summer, like having more time if we had the feedback to work on it. But I guess June would be when it would make sense because the board not meet in July and then you're like right before school. So really June, if it was to be for the next school year, is that really kind of like June would be the latest to be kind of making some of these calls?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think I just want to share that I feel comfortable putting it off longer because I do think that's a lot to be asking leaders to give us when they're under so much stress right now. So.
Perfect.
So I think if there aren't, go ahead, Roberta. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say I don't see any other concerns or any other comments. So yeah, I mean, there was no urgency on this. It was kind of like a part of a conversation. So let's put it off and then we'll carry on with what we already had on the slate. Planting a flag on it for us to come back to. Thank you.
Well, Jake, why don't we start then just in the review? So, tonight, we'll wanted to start with kind of moving through these discipline policies with the aim to kind of try and move through them together. Again, kind of the context is the prior iteration of the policy committee has had a chance to review each of these once. They've had 2 rounds of feedback with our parent advisory committee. We have shared these policies and the revisions as well with our school administrative team, and we have shared these policies with PEA, the teachers, through the Living Contract Committee. So there's been, substantive review, and of course we had the review from Drummond Woodson, our legal partners, in December, kind of during the course of this. So that's kind of what brings us to where we're at today. So Jake continues to do a masterful job of trying to synthesize all the various points of input and feedback to try and have I think what we'll look at tonight is kind of our most comprehensive versions for consideration tonight, so that kind of you have the looking in front of it with ideally the last, with possibly the last stop before voting to go to the full board, kind of the versions that represent all of that feedback. But so I think we should start with the weapon JICIA, which we didn't get to last meeting, before we move into bullying and expulsion. So Jacob's open if we want to do the same routine of sharing your screen, so you should be able to share and step us through that.
Okay. So this is the policy that we didn't get to last time. And I'll do a slow scroll to allow people to refresh their memory about it. So here in the screen now are the most substantive changes. Reference to the district threat assessment protocol, which is a mitigating measure against inequitable or rash applications of the policy. And secondly, a removal of sort of the mandatory sentence language.
Sorry, is the red writing the writing that was newly added, or it's the one that has been deleted?
Yeah, so the red writing is new language, and on the sidebar there, that's the language that was deleted.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. And the final comment in the sidebar there is just removing what seemed to be superfluous language authorizing the superintendent to do things.
Do we have any questions? I have a question, Jake. Can you scroll up or back, bring the document back down? There's just for section A. Let me get mine. Oh wait, I do have a hand up. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go. Jeff, why don't you go first, and then I'll save mine for later.
I'm sorry, it's my first time reading this. The deleted portion doesn't. Aren't we statutory obligated under 20A Maine revised statute to follow that guidance? Are we removing it to make it just more broad? I guess I'm trying to figure out the rationale behind removing that if we seem to be compelled statutorily to follow through with that. If I maybe provide some more guidance.
Yeah, and to be completely transparent, this process has gone on so long that I'm forgetting the origins of all the revisions, but looking at it, there's two parts to that deletion.
Yeah.
The first says that a student who brings a firearm to school shall be expelled for at least a year unless you don't do that, which I don't know how, it's almost like gratuitous threatening language in my mind. The second part is that all firearms violations shall be referred to law enforcement authorities as required by law. I don't know if that's if that should be in there. I know that we're in like a big conversation about what exactly is our protocol for involving law enforcement. I would say that probably anytime a student brings a gun to school, law enforcement would be involved. But
I would hope so, but it seems as if reteaching of expectations for someone who brings a weapon into school.
Yeah, I think so. Just to point out, and it looks like Javier has something to say, but the policy does have the potential to be applied to things like pencils and paper clips. So I think that's part of the balance that's needs to be struck there.
As classified as a weapon. And I'm sorry, Javier, if you have something to add, I'm happy to.
Yeah.
Go ahead and finish your train of thought, and then I'll.
This part here. And,
yeah,
and the history of national controversy around application of some of these policies.
Yeah.
All right, Jeff, are you?
Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. So I guess I would say that the way that it's written, it still stipulates that expulsion is a possibility. It specifies based on the facts, and it says that that it shall be done in accordance with applicable state and federal laws and board and school policy. So, to the extent that reporting a firearm violation to law enforcement is required by state or federal law, we would do that. And, again, to I think Jake's point, it basically is redundant to say that, the student shall be expelled unless modified. So this leaves expulsion. So it doesn't remove expulsion as a option. It just doesn't say that you can be expelled unless you're not. So I think that, the part that I am somewhat uncomfortable on is the fact that it says in accordance with applicable state and federal laws. And I feel like having some link or, a summary of what those might be is helpful. I'm assuming that they are included below in the legal references, but I don't, like in a situation, if it were an issue that I wasn't familiar with, I would have, you'd have to go and look at 20 USC, the Gun Free Schools Act, to see what is actually stipulated in there. So that makes me a little bit nervous, and actually there was a time when I knew that really well, but, fortunately not anymore. And so, I do feel that somehow, maybe consulting with counsel on what is the appropriate level of reference to those state laws and statutes would be possibly helpful.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I think normally when we do policies review, especially significant ones, we would have them reviewed by legal counsel before the board approves them, or often it is requested by the board that it be reviewed. So that I think would be something that would be flagged for them to make sure that we are complying with any legal requirements. Yeah, Aaron, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just to that point, I have we did have Drummond review this. And so I think to this specific discussion they had, and I was going to ask Jake, I'm feeling somewhat the same way, given that, trying to remember when and why we had made some choices a few months ago. But what they flag is language that I don't believe had been in our prior policy that does say must be included. So this is language and maybe I can put this in the chat. Let me do that just so that everybody can see it and hear, and I'll do that for attendees as well. So this language, Drummond has said must be included. So as it is required by law.
Yeah.
And then regarding kind of like that sentence that had been in there of like, you can expel them unless you decide not to, or in the, refer to law enforcement, those are not required. The feedback they gave is those contain legal requirements. They are not required to be included in the policy in that way. So yes, there is a legal requirement to report law enforcement or firearms violations to law enforcement, is what they're, naming and citing. It doesn't mean that is required to be in the policy in that way. So that's a choice for us to include that language in that way, that explicitness. I do feel a little bit similar to you, Javier, that like, if part of the purpose, and I think that the Center for Educational Equity's review, part of the gist of their feedback was making things plain and transparent to families, that bearing the lead on this, if you will, that we're required to report firearms violations to law enforcement, just with some generic language about applicable board and school policy. Feels like something that we should try and make easily accessible to anybody, including our administrators and everybody, just like to our full community, that's a legal requirement that we're responsible for. So anyway, so that's a little bit of what the Drummond feedback was, Roberto, to your questions and kind of their feedback on these points.
Great, that's helpful. Jeff, does that help? Kind of, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just playing one scenario through my mind. Are we in a position, does this policy put us in a position where hypothetically a student of any age walks into a school with a firearm, requires us to report them based on the statutory requirements, but then not, if after appropriate investigation, either suspend or expel them? Could that be a scenario that's played out?
Yes. And that is a scenario that I'm not muted. That's a scenario that plays itself out frequently. I don't want to say frequently, but that can potentially occur. It's a student brought a knife by mistake. Didn't brandish it in any way. That student would not be expelled, potentially, wouldn't even be suspended. That would be on a case by case. You would look at the circumstances, but that wouldn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't report that, to law enforcement.
Well, just to be clear, the language that says that is required by law is firearms violations.
Yeah, you're right.
So it would need to meet that threat, that definition.
Yeah. So it could be somebody had a BB gun. A young kid might have a BB gun in their backpack and never took it out, never threatened anybody, but had showed it to a kid this is an actual event in my past life, had showed it to another student at a bus stop, and then brought it to school, and you'd have to report that, and however, you may not expel the student.
And I think that, that just to one of your earlier questions, Jeff, the intent of including this language around the threat assessment that we've done, training and support for admin on, has been to be able to, evaluate quickly, what is the actual threat and intent. That's where the language of kind of substantive threats or not kind of plays into it. So that's, that's where things could kind of go in different directions. You have potentially legal obligations, right? If it's a firearm, but then the determination of like what needs to happen within the context of the school community to keep it safe, based on the analysis of the threat, kind of comes out of that work.
Yeah, I'm sorry to keep delaying this, but I'm just a little, I don't want to say apprehensive, but perhaps ill-informed is probably a better description, is the level of training and to whom it's given and who has the ultimate authority to say, I deem this as a threat. I deem this, the young child with the BB gun's one example, but if we take closer looks on I guess I just have to be a little bit more well-informed on what the training might look like in order to ask better questions. So yeah, I appreciate the feedback.
And Jeff, I'll just say quickly from the field, the protocol is those decisions are made by kind of an interdisciplinary team at the building level, administrator, social worker. And ultimately, the responsibility is going to lay with the principal, and ultimately beyond that with Aaron and Javier. But, the idea is to have a scaffolding so a small group can go through a quick protocol to make a measured decision.
Thank you, Jake.
Laura, go ahead.
Thank you. Jake, would you mind just scrolling up to where it had the list of all the weapons, like with the detail? Thank you. I just was, Aaron, when you mentioned you said the law actually states for a firearm, that's what would need to be reported. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I was just like, okay, is an air gun, like when Javier, you said pellet gun, I'm like, is an air gun a firearm? Is ammunition, is explosive? I guess I'm just like, then I realized like maybe firearms is even more than just a gun. Like, I don't know. Does anybody know the detail of that?
I don't, but I could find out and include a definition.
Okay, thank you. Because when I saw that, sorry, go ahead.
I believe it is. You know, just like a crossbow would also be included as a firearm.
Oh, it would? Okay.
Well, I'll check statute.
Or ammunition. Yeah, so I guess I'm just wondering, and when you had that list, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, these are all things that are potentially brought into schools and obviously dangerous, but yeah, I would just help me to understand what the actual, what would be, as part of the law, have to be reported and what doesn't. What is included and what it isn't, I guess, would be helpful.
So would so is what I'm hearing potentially a recommendation for this policy to include the statutory language that Drummond said should be included, which is what I put in the chat, and then to add back the language about firearm referral to law enforcement with the with some definition about firearm there. Just trying to summarize kind of this discussion.
I'll just say, maybe we could discuss it more. I wasn't asking for it to be in the policy. It was more just for me to understand, but maybe if anyone else has any thoughts about how that would be useful to have that detail. I guess I was just trying to have a better understanding of what would require a report to law enforcement, I guess.
Yeah. I think if we put that back, it's in the name of transparency to include a definition, assuming that there's a clean definition.
Yeah, okay.
So I'll research that.
Okay. Are there any other? That's kind of the proposal on the table. Is there any other feedback or on this policy or about that proposal?
So I'm sorry, just to be clear, the instances in which we would call law enforcement would just be for for example, in here would just be not for what's included in C, or are we calling law enforcement for only for? So I'm sorry, I just want to be
for the purposes of this policy. There's a requirement that we involve law enforcement in the case of a firearm. So that's an obligation. Beyond that, I think it would be governed by any other policies that we have about law enforcement coming.
Yeah, I think.
And in so it's just because like for example, when you have the descriptions that we have in C, and I'm just, are those included? So all of those. So every time that if there's a
pencil is definitely not a firearm.
Yeah. Okay.
So I do not think C will be included in the definition of a firearm, and I do not think necessarily everything in A would be included either. So I think that would be the intent of adding that language, down in that section where it was previously to add the definition.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. I know we keep just highlighting it. Just want to make sure.
No, right. That's important.
Yeah, and understand the intent of, as we get into the law enforcement, having a very specific scope, right, in terms of which, and meeting our, legal responsibilities of involving law enforcement where we're required to, but, not necessarily expanding beyond that. Laura, would you?
Unmute myself. Laura, go ahead.
Thank you. I just have a sort of more general, well, not a general question, but a question that would just help me understand how this policy is going to be used. I was just thinking for students, like right now, I mean, I think most students are pretty clear about, you know, rules about guns or something, but I'm just thinking like, does anyone have a sense that could just share with me right now, like just all these details about other, you know, rules about objects and how they cannot be brought in the school at all? Like, how is that shared with students right now? Is that something anybody could, just to help me like frame how this is going to be sharing and what students maybe, how they're already informed about this information? Emily can tell us.
A couple quick things from the field. The district did release some materials to hang on the walls, kind of listing some of these prohibitions, and some guidance about reporting things if you see them. I will say that I don't, these things might be listed in handbooks, but they're generally not at the level of like classroom lessons to begin the year. Like in most, some of it is pretty common sense.
Can I add something to that? So I think I had a conversation with the superintendent about this recently, and on Aura, that's a really good question. So, you know, it was about a different situation, but in essence, the message or the sentiment that I was trying to get across is very important when there is law enforcement involved, is that the student always understands their legal rights. And so that includes their legal rights to when they're answering questions, you know, whether there's an adult present, who is their legal guardians, things like that. So the educational piece is, I think, really, really important. Like, for example, when we have students who have, you know, whenever, just literally what we're doing, right? Like when law enforcement comes into the building for whatever reason, be it, you know, a police officer or for any reason, whatever, you know, you want to educate the student what their rights are. There might be options to doing these encounters somewhere else other than in school. Maybe they want to do it at their home when their parents are available, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that educating the kids and their families is key to this long term. So we should definitely talk about that.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, when we go back to, sorry, just to jump in, but I think, you know, the language that we used, and again, I think, you know, we're trying to, I believe it's JK, just kind of the foundational document around discipline, talks about the, you know, the process of engaging communities and, you know, approaching this work from an education standpoint, communicating the expectations up front. So I think I agree with all of that. And I think we have included some language in, you know, some of the prior policies that, you know, we have referred to as kind of the foundational policies about student discipline and code of conduct around like what that approach should be. So I think, you know, if we, you know, I think part of our approach with the revision of this suite of policies is to have those be the foundational approach. And then these more specific ones dealing with more specific discrete instances. So, you know, and maybe it's a leap too far, but I think the assumption would be, you know, we are doing that work, right? And I think that does play out in terms of setting these expectations about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And I think it's you know, not that, you know, it means in every, you know, handbook, I mean, you can't, I mean, maybe it does say, you know, talking about lighters and that kind of things, but a lot of these things are actual classroom implements that you would use. And it's thus then about the manner in which they're used, which I think comes back to why the importance of including the language around the threat assessment, right? So and that's what that essentially uncovers for us as part of that role, as a student is understanding what a student's intent is or may have been, right, with something like this. So, within the context of weapons, violence, and school safety, it's really that threat assessment that helps us evaluate whether any of these instruments were intended to create harm or fear, even not necessarily even harm, but fear.
And I think that's really helpful, Aaron, because I think, I was just trying to get, because there was language in here, right, about, I forgot what the word was, Jake, but it was about like reiterating expectations or something, right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess I'm just really thinking to myself, especially, I mean, this is throughout the K to 12, right? And I'm thinking, like, we have a lot of students that come that have gone to school in another country too, right? So we have this expectation that it's common sense. I mean, obviously a gun you think is common sense, right? But that was a list of a lot of things that a student could, and they don't have to have gone to school in another country, but I'm just thinking as an example of like our expectation of what we would expect is not okay to bring, but it might be something that a kid wouldn't even be thinking that would be used in a violent manner, but like it could have been on that list. So I'm just trying to think, like, being really clear about expectations seems really important. And so I guess I'm just thinking it's probably shared differently in different buildings and throughout. So but that was helpful, Aaron, just that it's a case by case, like just that I'm sure there are lots of incidents where a kid was certainly not intending to use something to harm anyone. So thank you for clarifying.
Thank you. All right. If no other questions, we can move on.
Okay. So again, just moving on though, just to clarify, right, is with the kind of friendly amendment of one addition, or those two additional modifications, including what Drummond indicated was required language, that which you put in the chat, right, and then reinserting the language to make transparent to all community members about the firearm referral to law enforcement.
So yeah, I'm good with that for now. I think that it makes sense to add it there. I think when it gets to the full board discussion, maybe after I had a chance to kind of sit on the entirety and after reflecting on tonight's discussion, maybe something else comes up. But as is right now, this seems like the logical thing to include at this point, based on what we're hearing.
Okay. All right. Okay. Jake, do we want to? We can go to bullying next. I don't know if
Jeff.
Sorry, I'll keep this real brief, hopefully. I was looking over the weekend, the Department of Education data warehouse, where it kind of displays a historical narrative. I think it was 2011 forward, about behavioral charts with respect to incidents and resolutions with student behavior. And I know that the numbers were a collective for Portland Public Schools. Do we have that number I don't know, from a breakdown for individual schools?
Yes, depends on what you're asking about. Like suspension data, yes.
Suspension data, whether or not an incident was with a firearm or without a firearm, or I think the classification was firearm or other weapon.
Yeah, the short answer is anything that gets reported to the state and the feds is in our student information system and can be disaggregated by school.
Is that something that I can request?
Yeah, and
with redacted, obviously, redacted information, just to get a better scope of.
Yes, yeah, it's a public report, and yes. And what's the time frame that you want?
I understand there's a lot going on, so anytime before the next discussion would be great.
No.
Just the last 2019 would probably be the best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And again, I'm happy to shared the suspension data after our last meeting. So I think.
Yeah, I thought that was that, and I thank you for that report. But it was a breakdown based on racial component, and I was hoping that it would be more of an action of what's reported to the Department of Education rather than
by incident or by
type.
by type.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to share JICK, bullying and cyberbullying in schools. And again, I'll do the low scroll as you refamiliarize yourself.
And Jake, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of this new language in red here is language that was inserted or modified, intended so that it was consistent with the revised student harassment, discrimination, and sexual harassment policy. Because there's, as this policy indicates, there's a fair amount of overlap between bullying and harassment, or could be. And so,
yeah, most of the revision is to bring this in line with the new AACA policy that the board approved.
Jake, can we pause here for a moment? I was thinking whether to ask this or not, but as we were scrolling past it, I said, let me get it now before we, it skipped my mind. On the new language, the PPS will use age-appropriate preventative and responsive strategies that empower. Has anyone ever suggested that instead of age-appropriate, that we use something more like situational, like what's appropriate, or because like age is not really what differentiates our capacity to deal with any of these situations, right? Like that's not how we categorize the incidents. They're very specific. So it's more, not all 12-year-old issues are going to be guided by the 12-year-old issue guidebook or handbook, right? So maybe I don't know, developmentally appropriate. Look, thank you. The social worker steps in with the right language. Awesome. Or I just wrote in the chat. Does that make sense? Or is that not worth?
That feels non-controversial and probably an enhancement. I don't know if that language is from AACA, but we could certainly update it here.
Can you point out where it is?
Yeah.
Lost where the age. Okay, thanks.
It's also in the final paragraph before definitions.
Thanks.
I like developmentally just because, Roberto, your comment about age, but also just, there are lots of reasons why someone could be an age, and developmentally, not, we have to look at where a student is going to be able to hear and understand. So I like that. It just gives a more broad definition of how to share information with somebody so that they can receive it.
Yeah, I agree.
It's like me being immature.
I'm scrolling to the definition of bullying, which is from statute, and I just in the comment point out that two things. I had proposed that there be a fourth bullet, that it be something that had some kind of recurring nature, because I think naturalistically speaking, that's what we think of as bullying. But that Drummond said, no, we can't do that, this is the statutory definition. A drawback of that is that really a lot of things that happen in a school day could fall under the aegis of this policy, like a kid saying just anything that's mean. So that, in my mind, that's a problem with the policy. I mean, the statute, not the policy. Secondly, I'm pointing out in the comment that the numbers 1, 2, and 3, the way the statute is written, it's unclear if all 3 are meant to be satisfied or if that's a either or list. If all 3 are meant to be satisfied, it kind of doesn't make sense, because if the third one is satisfied, it actually is a matter of harassment under ACAA. So I can't fix statute.
I mean, for clarity for our purposes, Jake, then, in terms of your insertion below where it says examples of conduct that may constitute bullying, if they meet one of the, or,
I don't know.
Sorry, go ahead, Roberto.
No.
That's really clean. Like, we could do that if that captures what we want to actually do. So that creates a really expansive definition of bullying.
Can you clarify what the change would be again, Aaron?
He's saying right here, this language, this is not statutory, but this could say, instead of saying if they meet the above criteria, it could say if they meet one of the above criteria.
One of, okay, thank you.
I mean, I recognize this has been a challenging standard to apply, as Jake is referring to, by administrators. And I mean, as I look at, A1, and A2 that has a reasonable person would expect it to have the effect of physically harming a student or damaging a student's property or placing a student in fear of that or interfering with their rights, those all seem like things that, we're seeking to prohibit and, counter to the, kind of safe and equitable environment in many ways. So.
Yeah, I agree. But the having it constitute bullying kind of triggers a higher burden of reporting and process than is necessary for some student behaviors, is my concern.
Yeah, like what's the reporting? What ends up happening? What's the bully's side of this interaction?
I'm going to scroll ahead real quick. I'll come back. But, oh, that's not. Here we go. Written versions of this policy. I'm sorry to be scrolling. I'm just doing this for myself to refresh myself real quick. Perhaps the policy is written such that the burden isn't completely onerous. We're proposing some language that will allow us to drop the board level reporting process. I think as an assistant principal, I still bristle at the idea that every mean behavior falls under the umbrella of bullying. But Drummond said, tough luck.
So Jake, I'm sorry, could you clarify? I know you mentioned that concern before and you said that's part of the statute that we can't change, right?
That's what Drummond says.
Okay, so I mean, to me, I hear what you're saying, but isn't the repetitive nature of it, isn't that part pretty clear? That, or do you not feel like that's clearly stating that just one mean thing that a child might say to someone else wouldn't constitute bullying? But I mean, I feel like it says the repetitive piece, but
where do you see it?
that might have just been in one of the, let's see, listed.
It is right here in the example that I wrote, but it's not in the statute. So in this section here,
Okay.
I had suggested a revision of item 4, which mentioned recurring nature. And Drummond said we couldn't add that because that constricts the definition further than statute.
Okay, so that was the only place that said something about repeated, right? Is that okay?
I had it in the first read, so you may be remembering that.
No, I think I just, okay. Well, that makes more sense why you're concerned. I think just because I'd seen the one thing about, so okay, so even if we were to put it in there, the statute itself does not have the language about repeated. So that's why you're saying that.
Against adding that.
Sorry, say it again?
And Drummond told us we should not add that.
Okay. And so just to clarify, your concern is that the way the statute is written, that, I mean, there's just the ability for someone to say that one mean action could be considered bullying, and that's a concern of, yeah. Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and really of any intensity.
Right. Wow. But then how do we deal with that if that's what the language is? Sorry, I don't have any good answer to that. Just trying to clarify. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to keep scrolling for y'all.
Can I ask a question? What, Jake? What for like for middle school? When you've encountered incidents of bullying, how does what you've seen as practice reflect, like, or rather compared to what you see here? Like, have you seen, like, what are the essays look like when, like it suggests here, writing an essay?
I think that this list in B, that 10-item list, is reflective of kind of the palette of responses that happen at middle schools. I can't call to mind any essay that I've assigned, but we certainly have had some counselors interview a student and maybe include some writing in that.
I guess what I meant, like, how do you feel about it saying in the policy to write an essay? Like, is that, like, as far, maybe not as prescriptive versus not, but it just, that kind of stood out to me, and just some of the other issues. I see Emily has her hand raised. Or does she still?
Yeah, just one thing that popped up in my mind reading this document about, like, all of the things that will qualify as bullying and, like, what we would do if that were to happen. But something that I thought about was how we only really need these policies if something gets reported, and, like, after someone chooses to, like, speak up to administration or their teachers, or whether or not teachers decide to report. Because from what I've heard from peers and from myself even in the past, is like teachers will hear things, be like, oh, the kids, they'll figure it out. Like, is that really bullying? Or are they just, like, teasing around? She looks like she's doing all right. So in this policy, or within the policies that we're making, because we have quite a bit, are we talking about any policies about creating, like, the right environment for, like, more reporting, or, like, conducive to someone speaking up?
That's a good question. At the header, there was a comment from Center for Education Equity that they suggested or was it this policy? A confidential reporting.
I guess I would also, I would say that that's what the harassment, sexual harassment and discrimination policy is at the core of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's, creating, mechanisms for reporting, and also institutionalizing training that will prepare staff to take those situations, and analyze them using a framework.
So one possible course of action is to go back to AACA and bring more of it over into this policy. I say that with some hesitancy to add, because of, that I'm speaking as a stakeholder now, not as a reviser of these policies, but the definition is troubling to me. But I hear what you're saying, Emily.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that, Mr. Geisman?
Yeah, sure.
What your hesitancy comes from?
Yeah. Bullying is kind of an all caps word. And sometimes like you allude to, we underestimate the severity of an issue and under respond to it. And sometimes an issue that is in reality small and could be dealt with in a less intensive way gets called bullying as, as an attempt to elevate it in importance. So I guess I'm saying that as an assistant principal, I tend not to think of small, non-recurring tensions between kids as bullying, for what that's worth. I think of it as mean behavior that needs to be addressed.
There's just more, like, ambiguity in it in comparison to, like, the harassment policies.
Yeah, well, the harassment policy has a lot more specificity because it's about protected classes.
That makes sense.
It's the old kind of like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You know, when bullying is such a broad description, it's easier to describe it. Every interaction is bullying.
Yeah.
Aura, you have your hands.
Jake, was there more to go through? Because I can wait. I didn't want to forget a couple things I wanted to ask that were earlier. But
There's apparently 2.5 more pages.
okay, so I'll wait. I'll just jot down my question. Okay.
Oh, we saw that already.
I mean, yeah, Jake, do we want to speak here? Just I'm mindful of time a little bit. That the recommendation as it relates to the documentation is one of the barriers we feel like has been in reporting has been the utilization of what is that JICK E2, which is a long kind of form that's intended to be used to document the investigation. Where we are trying to go is encouraging, and we've already rolled out, expectations for school leaders to document these instances within Infinite Campus so that we can do the appropriate federal reporting and all of those kinds of issues. So at this point, it feels, and it captures the appropriate information needed for that reporting. So it is up to our discretion about utilizing that form. It's not required. And so our recommendation here as it relates to documentation is to kind of discontinue the use of that form just so that we're able to streamline for administrators, one point of entry for data. And this is a consistent approach we're trying to take across all of these policies so that we can have more actionable data about what's going on in our systems. So,
and I've add that this is a preferable, an existing data entry practice that is preferable to the form because it's actually in the student information system ready to be uploaded and analyzed.
A bit of modernization there.
Sorry, Jeff, you have a question?
One quick question. Is that to remove duplicative entry, or are we losing any data points by switching to that so there's no missing data points?
It's removing a duplicate and non-useful data entry field or data entry instrument.
Thank you.
In this last comment, just in this main format, just the Drummond feedback on this piece about what the school board is responsible for that Emily had asked, I think, in the first read when she was still on the policy committee before all the changes. The Drummond feedback on this was that the board can delegate that authority. The law and the department's model policy still includes this, but there's no reason the board couldn't delegate these responsibilities to the superintendent. So, because I think it stands out as awkward of why the school board doesn't actually do any of that work, right? Or it's not positioned to. So that could be the amendment there is, to delegate that to the superintendent or designee.
Great. And this is Mr. Batana's to-do list. And the end.
So, Jake, given that we can't change the definition of bullying, that we're kind of stuck with that. That in itself is very restrictive. Like that leaves us not very much wiggle room, so to speak, in terms of So yeah, how do we? I'm sorry, I don't want to take us back to a broad question like that. Aura, you have a question? You have a question?
Well, I think one thing I just that was way back, and you don't have to find it, Jake, because I remember it was in the technology part, and it was about emails, and I just was thinking how that part, when Jake was talking about kind of the fine line about bullying, right? Like we don't want to certainly there's a lot of issue of like under response about bullying, right? So we certainly want to take it seriously. Then there's the challenge on the other side of, kids' behavior that is potentially concerning or needs to be addressed, like you said, Jake, but wouldn't meet the criteria of bullying. And so this was just one example, but it said the language of a mean email that was in there, and I thought, like how. I just don't know. Is it like each detail we'd have to go through and describe what would a mean email, and is it all having to spell out the frequency and the intensity, because that one, it just was like, well, kids are going to send mean email. There's a lot of instances where that could be certainly not bullying, right? So that one just stuck out to me.
Yeah, and I have a clarifying question for Aaron to just refresh my memory that maybe we don't even need. Maybe I'm making a big fuss about something that we don't need to. Is bullying one of the required things to enter into IC to report to the state?
Yes.
And saying yes. Okay, so as I read through this again, I still am concerned that I don't like families using the word bullying to describe everything that's mean, or kids or teachers. But set that aside, this policy kind of iterates a lot of things that we would do for any kind of behavior, whether you call it bullying or not. So that's not really the problem. Maybe the only onerous aspect, or the only burdensome aspect, is that theoretically every mean event would need to be logged into Infinite Campus with the details and the resolution. So at Lyman Moore, for example, where I was serving as assistant principal, we dealt with kind of minor incidents in a separate reporting system that's tied to PBIS that the district is leaning towards having all schools use, and we only recorded in Infinite Campus big things that are required by the state. So if bullying is required at that level of entry, and bullying could be construed to include a lot of things, that's maybe where the burden could lie. But it is what it is, maybe. So.
I mean, I think part of the, and there's just an ongoing management implementation support, with school leaders around this, because some of the statutory language is just what it is. So, we're not going to be able to fully resolve that here, but, it does, require an allegation of bullying. And yes, there is some context where that may be misapplied. I think historically our issue has not been over-reporting of bullying allegations. It certainly has been underreporting, and it could switch, but we have had very minimal documented reports of allegations of bullying, probably to the underreporting based on what students report, in some of the survey data, the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey, in terms of what they experience in terms of bullying. So I think I recognize from an administrator's perspective every mean incident, but it does take somebody calling it bullying, right, making that allegation to invoke the procedures spelled out here.
Yeah, I think
that's helpful to know, because that makes me think having it err on the side of way more freedom to call a mean email bullying when we know that's probably underreported. Does that make sense? Thinking that it's probably underreported, and knowing that some mean emails are not bullying, certainly, but that we want to have the leeway there for if that was, like Aaron, you're saying, if that was to be named bullying, that could be considered bullying. And a mean email could rise to that, right?
Yeah.
And I think if we rescind, or you rescind JICKE2, the redundant reporting mechanism, then you're going to see more reporting because administrators will report it using the existing systems.
Emily, did you still have a question or no? I didn't want to.
I was going to bring up the same thing about if it's being underreported, like what's really the harm in it being a little bit more broad, but I think it was answered.
So I had another question, Jake, that you guys might have been doing this work before I joined, delved into this a lot because I'm guessing the technology piece, right? That is a huge discussion, knowing that we know that bullying happens through social media and lots of technology. So I don't know how far you guys are already, but I guess where I had some questions was in the piece about, on school grounds and all those details. And then the part about technology, like, did it specifically say like about devices? There was something there, but like using school devices, like is that considered something that's the school's authority to report that, and we have responsibility?
Well, we certainly, we have a separate policy about student internet use and device policies that says on school, owned things, right? What they should do. This definition of cyberbullying applies to any device.
Okay.
So, if somebody's on their own personal phone is still.
But that's only if it's on school grounds, correct? I thought it said something about. No? Okay. I thought it was saying like on transportation or on school grounds and
this item, clause 4, takes place elsewhere or through the use of technology, but only if it interferes access to school services or creates a hostile school environment. Okay.
Well, Aaron, I think I was just thinking that meant only through the use of technology. That was like school-owned technology. But you're saying that anything that's used.
The definition of cyberbullying there.
Okay, so it really would be any student that is on whatever technology or social media, whatever it is, if it's about students in the school setting and it's having this impact, that's interfering with their school program, that is considered under this policy.
And really, in this day and age, that's the most vital thing that we need to be thinking about in terms of bullying, is that kind of kids on Snapchat at home. Yeah.
That's completely pervasive. Okay, well, thank you, because when I first saw that, I wasn't thinking it was that expansive.
Yeah.
But is that really, I'm just thinking of, hearing stories across the country and situations where this is happening. Is this becoming more the norm, that this is considered like the purvey of the school, like you're saying, across all technology and in and out of school?
If it's impacting the student in the school environment, yeah. And that's what bullying looks like in 2021.
Yes.
Is TikTok and Snapchat.
Yes.
It's not stealing your lunch money behind.
Yes. Well, thank you. This is just very educational for me, and knowing that this is certainly part of policy, that this is the school's purvey.
There was legislation like this policy is not that old in the context of our policies, and that's because there was legislation. It said the last update was 2016, so I think that specifically to address and include cyberbullying in this definition.
Okay, well, here's one more follow-up just for me to understand further because Aaron, you were saying it constitutes bullying if someone reports it as such, right? So does this get into any detail of, a student comes and tells the vice principal, somebody posted nude pictures of a student, and, they report that. Does that start and then if the student is brought in and says that, like, when would something that clearly would meet all these criteria as bullying, just got to have to be so many different ways that information gets to, right? Yeah.
So an addendum to what Aaron said, I don't think the complainant would need to necessarily use the word bullying. It could also be a determination of the administrator.
Okay, so if information gets to administrator about an image or language or whatever, that could start that process at that point.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And does.
Yes. Thank you.
Jeff, you had a question?
Just a quick question. I was just looking at that data warehouse, and I know Aaron just mentioned that the last update was 2016, but what's reported on that website is just a one case of bullying from King Middle School. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if that's the difference between the use of the state reporting mandate and PBIS. Is that
No, well, one, just clarifying, when I was referring to 2016, I was just saying the policy was last updated in 2016. Yeah. But no, just the procedure was historically is that the expectation to document instances of bullying was that people would complete that other form, the JIC E2, and they would need to submit it to Ann's predecessor, Janet, and that was what, and she collected those, and that was what informed the reporting of bullying. And so, that as we, began to surface this disconnect between what students are reported of, like how much they experience bullying and what's formally reported. One of the barriers, it's not the only one, but has been kind of the, those expectations, in that process that just sits outside of any of our other systems, in terms of reporting. So that's, again, back to why we're proposing eliminating that. That's not the only thing that, needs to happen to try and accelerate not accelerate it, but to accurately capture, right, what's happening. But that's one of the moves we can make here to contribute to that.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one more question about the cyberbullying? So I'm back to just thinking, like, where is the part where students know this expectation, right? Because, I mean, it's the norm that kids are on social media and having the, the stuff all the time. So where is that expectation clear that all of that outside of school stuff, that is something that we have a responsibility in knowing about if kids don't feel safe. Like,
so there is language in this policy about education that I can tell you from the field again, that in practice, it's a combination of counselor lessons in the classroom and outside nonprofits coming in. And
okay.
So it probably looks different in different buildings.
Okay, but those are ongoing every year.
In my experience in one building.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
But probably not as clear and consistent as, what Jake is suggesting happens at more, happening across the district. So I do think that, the extent to which there is language in the policy that speaks to that, the materials and ongoing training, I think, is important.
And I would imagine, just as things happen so rapidly and change, right, the way that youth are communicating and in ways that, just for students to keep up with what the expectations are, but also for staff to understand, right, like what's going on out there with kids communicating with each other, but also just like all the ways that kids can feel unsafe, right? Like that's just got to be rapidly changing all the time. So anyway, just thinking out loud that's got to be something that probably just has to be like updated all the time, I'm guessing.
Right. Any other comments around the bullying policy, or people comfortable with proposed revisions and the elimination of the JIC KE2 documents?
It sounds like.
As long as I don't have to remember all of those acronyms, because I can't.
Yeah, well, we're banishing that one, so reducing it by one. Let's pivot to the expulsion and expulsion guidelines. I think the expulsion policy itself has just a brief, and Jake, if you don't mind on this one, just looking at the time, kind of, well, I guess, I don't know if everybody has reviewed it. I know it was tardying for this meeting and getting the materials posted, not as early as I would have wanted, but you
You're going to do a quick run through of those two?
yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Okay, this is a one page, all fits all on the screen. The salient revisions are to assert that it's an intervention of absolute last resort, which conforms with practice in Portland. An acknowledgement that some families will need translation and interpretation. And then number 3 is a recommendation from Center for Educational Equity. I think. I don't remember where 3 came from in full candor. And the other policy describes the process in more detail. So anything that stands out here as an item of concern?
Aura, you have a question?
Yeah, Jay, can I just clarify with the designate someone with expertise to investigate? So is that like at the district level or in buildings? You know what the intent?
Well, the language is such that the superintendent shall designate this person, and I apologize, I don't even think I have the Center for Education Equity document with me right now to look to see if that's where that's from.
You're referring to number 3. I was looking back in our minutes from the first read, and this was based on a recommendation from member Figdor at the time.
Okay.
In terms of, and I mean, it has shades, and shout out to Claire as an attendee who, shared the recently adopted Maine legislation around the racial impact analysis. So this is not quite the same thing, but certainly to some degree emanating from the same, kind of set of beliefs and considerations. So that was where that came from. And I believe there was something similar to that in our suspension policy.
So is the intent in that to, I guess I'm just trying to understand if that's meant to be a person that has that role through the district or someone in buildings when there is a case of a hearing on expulsion?
It would definitely be at the district.
Okay, so this would be someone who is a staff person but has this role?
Not necessarily.
No, because it says to be not involved, right? So, okay.
It could be outside. And this, just a reminder, this is an exceedingly low incidence policy.
Yeah.
So if there's a burdensome aspect to it, it will rarely be operationalized.
Okay. So this could be someone that's brought in to do this on case, but it's not that this is a role that's like and if it's rarely used, then it could just be case by case. Someone would be asked to come in for this incident to have this role. Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you. I thought it was more of like a, but thank you for the framing that it's would rarely be used. That helps.
So if it's okay, I'm going to switch over to JKER, which has a little more of the fine details. About the hearing process. And this just as a reminder, is for expelling a student completely from the school district, which I'm not aware of it happening in my time in Portland.
There's been one instance in the last 5 years, and I think there were none in the 10 years prior. So according to Janet.
Jake, I'm sorry, can you go back up just a little bit? Just the last, there you go.
I guess I want to chime in just for a minute. There aren't any other additional proposed revisions to the procedure beyond what we've already kind of scrolled past. So again, just kind of conscious of time. I mean, certainly if folks want it and need it, I don't mean to rush people, kind of through that, but the main substantive one is the adding of including the expectations around translation, right? And then carrying over this language around the racial impact analysis to the expulsion process.
Yeah. So given with those changes being the main ones, I'm okay with that being added. I don't know if anyone else has questions or comments. I did have one comment on something that's not highlighted or something that wasn't mentioned. So because of this explains how the meeting would happen, but the meeting could potentially happen without the student and family being there, as long as we've sent them a notification of the meeting and giving them that information. So potentially, and admittedly these are really rare occurrences, but potentially a student could be expelled from the district without them or their family being present at the hearing in which they're being expelled. So I have two questions around that. Number one, as policies go, that to me, that I would rather that not be the case, but I appreciate that the policy does make it clear that a communication has to be sent, and that it's not like we're expelling a kid without them knowing that it's happening. And obviously there's a sequence of events that lead to this. This doesn't happen, overnight. But again, the policy does leave it open. So I would much rather the board be much more slow to make that decision and exhaust every effort without a timeline, although maybe legality might give us a timeline. Anyways, I would rather, Javier knows where I'm getting to. I would rather not expel a kid from the district without them and their family being present at the meeting.
Can I just throw out there an idea, Roberto, in that vein? I would like it to say something further than just, was it a letter? Just like something that, every effort being made, just like something saying that every effort being made to include them as part of it, something like that. I don't know what the best language, but.
Jeff?
If you wouldn't mind scrolling up just a little bit, I'll just try to keep it quick. Back to the hearing portion right there. So, as part of a hearing, and under the rules of a hearing, the standard rules, I suppose, does a statement from a designee with sufficient expertise weighing in one way or another on a particular incident in front of a hearing, does that skew the hearing itself by having that piece of that documentation as part of the hearing?
Well, the intention is to unskew.
I'm sorry?
I think the intention would be to unskew the hearing if there's some implicit bias at play.
I mean, frankly, from my perspective, if I can weigh in on that, I don't think I would make expulsion recommendation if we had a report that suggested that there was racial or other bias in the recommendation. So I think that's from my perspective.
Okay, I'm not trying to discount it, and I know it's minimalized with respect to the occurrences in the past, but I'll follow up with questions because I know in the interest of time we have some. I'll follow up with Aaron or Javier. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Good. So again, the changes that are the red ink changes look good. We don't need to hold up moving it forward and moving to the next one to have the discussion about the how the meetings could take place. Again, that's just pointing that out that the policy does. I just want the board to be aware, at the very least, that the policy does leave it open for that to happen. And again, that's happened once in the last 10 years. So just want to highlight that again. Okay, so obviously we're really over time right now. Do we have anything else, Jake or Aaron, that you need us to cover real quick before we adjourn?
So the other two policies would be the third read. So those are the two umbrella policies that we went over with fine-tooth comb before.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you want to just very super briefly, well, one, we did, say we were going to go till 8 this time.
I'm sorry. You're right. I'm sorry. I as I was pressing us, I said, why am I the only one that's rushed?
Not that I'm against an early dismissal, but, so I think, I guess I would like to then just pose the question, and I guess back to essentially the three of you, Roberto, Ora, and Jeff, about, we've now gone through these, multiple iterations, right? Outside of the suspension policy and the questions around that, right? And I think, Roberto, this goes back, I think your language was like, I'm willing to kind of table that, or I don't know if that was exactly what you said earlier, but, what all this was leading to was action by the committee, right? And so I guess the question is, does the committee feel ready to take action to recommend any of these proposed revisions or revisions to any of these policies? We have 6 of them, right? To move forward to the full board. Again, this goes back to the original, kind of conception was we would move them all together in one kind of comprehensive batch, right? Which, for Jeff Nora's, context, that's something that's been done historically, and it's a group of related policies, right? To kind of put them all forward at one time. So I'm just curious around kind of the committee's guidance around next steps on this.
Yeah. So to that end, in the past, when we've done, for example, entire books of policies and presented it, literally in the presentation, there's like a spreadsheet that has all the policies listed, the most substantive changes highlighted, and then maybe a short little blurb, like a note referencing what the changes are, how they came about. Oh, this was suggested by X, Y, or this came out of the policy, this came out of the hearing sessions, whatever. And so one thing, when it's laid out like that, all in one document, one of the things that it lends itself to is that you can then see the overarching theme of it, right? Like you want to make sure that all of these policies are sort of following the same perspective and point of view. So that presentation is helpful. So if we can get to that level where we're seeing it laid out, I think then it'll be easier to say and I hate to add one more step, but then it'll be easier to say, let's move the whole package forward, or let's single out this one still needs just a little bit more polishing, whatever. So maybe that's the next level to really define it before we push it to the board in terms of a package. Does that make sense?
So yeah, what I hear you saying is like bringing back kind of like the, literally the full package, right? With that summary sheet as you're referencing that we've used before. And I can envision how we do that to the next policy committee meeting. And then that's what you guys would take action on, right? Or, provide feedback on potentially.
Yeah, if there's any major roadblocks, I think we'll identify them at that level. Because right now, I have what we did tonight in the forefront. Yeah, so I just want to see it all and make sure that we did follow the same kind of approach, and that they are all, that they all demonstrate, what we expect as our philosophy for discipline, which is, ultimately what we're trying to change here.
Well, Aaron, if that's what we do, let's you and I collaborate and I can do the heavy lifting, but to get that to the committee in time for them to read on their own time, because it will be impractical to go screen share, scroll through all the documents together.
So, Roberto, is it kind of like a workshop way? Is that how that gets discussed at a board meeting?
Yeah, and so I was, and I didn't mean to suggest how this is presented. I was referencing how when we've done it in the past, when we do big batches of policies, obviously all of the documents are uploaded into board docs, but then there's one kind of like guide document it's a spreadsheet, and it's a chart or a table rather, and it has all the policies listed. With just the main changes that came out of them in a summary, not like the actual kind of like, maybe it does have some language, but anyways, and then from there, you can kind of check, okay, I agree with that, or make yourself a little note like exclamation mark, So I think it's just, for me visually, it helps me see that the entire package is reflecting the direction in which we were hoping to get these policies into. But in essence, what we're approving is the policy itself. So you want to make sure that you read the entire document. I'm just asking, how it's presented for us to then dilute it into the next step.
I think, or part of your question was, we would, once this committee has made a determination, it would be on for like a first read, and then we'd have a workshop in the same way that we did with, the other, I think ACAA is the only Well, that was even before you were on the.
Yeah, so thank you. I was just trying to picture, like when you said, Roberto, like the light, like how it would be presented, and then I was just trying to picture how it would be brought to the board. So thank you.
Yeah, so I think we do a presentation, so there would be that documentation that Roberto's referring to. I think that will be super helpful. And then we'd probably do a little bit of a presentation about like, this has been our approach. This was the engagement we had, et cetera, right? To tee it up. Okay.
Okay, so then when is our next meeting?
Yep. So that would play out our cadence. Our next meeting is Wednesday, April 28th. Yes, Wednesday, April 28th. Is that right? Yes. Which is a busy week, I will just say.
Everybody pulled up their calendar at the same time. I'm like, oh God.
I mean, we're crunched with, spring break, right? Is the challenge again this month. But if we, so that would set us up for a cadence potentially of then having, depending on the committee's direction, right? But it could be a relatively short turnaround to then, if the committee then recommends to move it forward, it could go potentially as a first read, and then first read at the first meeting in May, and then the second read at the second meeting in May.
Sorry, I was as I was looking at the calendar as you were talking and trying to make it all work in my head. So I'm sorry. So on the 28th, we'll try to do the summary that we just talked about. So that would be the next step. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I think, depending on the pace of our work, right, we'll address that, right? Clearly with the time tonight, we're tabling we need to come back to the law enforcement summary, right, and kind of get the guidance so that we can dig into starting to make potential revisions to some of those policies, depending on that. But that could set us up for the sequence of then to consider revisions to those in May. Would be kind of the timeline that we would be considering. So.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. Like the next step. Yeah, that's good. I don't have anything else to say. Jeff or anything else?
Well, throughout this process, I've appreciated everybody's input. So thank you, Jeff, Emily, or Roberto. Appreciate your insights.
Yeah, and thank you, Jake, for doing so much. Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking about. I think it's been over a year now.
Like some other things.
It's good to we'll joke about that, but it's funny. It's really insightful though to see it from its inception through. It's really helpful, and obviously it makes it even easier to appreciate the work that goes into it, and the detail, the work, and the purposefulness of it. This is what I appreciate about how we do it. We worry and we get frustrated about how slow things work, but when you see the day-to-day work and how much energy and time goes into it, you appreciate it so much. And it's we talk about where people is what drives us, right? Like our staff, our teachers, our students, our families, and the day-to-day realities of their work is really what matters. All right. All right, so we're all set then. Appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for the overtime today, taking us to 8 o'clock. If we have a motion to adjourn, I'll take Aura, second by Jeff. All those in favor, please indicate, and we'll just raise our hand, and that's unanimous. All right, thank you so much. Good to see you, Emily. Take care. Have a good night.